Imagine a flight where a black billionaire's teenage son is humiliated in front of first-class passengers slapped across the face by a flight attendant. Seconds later, the aircraft doesn't take off, not because of weather, not because of mechanical failure, but because the airline didn't know who they just messed with. If stories of justice, identity, and power move you, don't scroll. Just subscribe now, because what's about to unfold will leave you shocked, inspired, and cheering in your seat. It began with a cloudy morning at JFK International Airport, the kind of day where people rush through terminals more focused on emails and time zones than faces or kindness. 17-year-old Elijah Bryant adjusted the Louis Vuitton backpack over his shoulder, his sneakers gleaming, his manner quiet yet confident, and his presence commanding even in silence. He didn't talk much, not because he was arrogant, but because he had grown up in boardrooms with billion-dollar conversations echoing in the background. His father, Malcolm Bryant, was one of the richest black billionaires in America, founder of Bryant Tech, a global AI empire that had revolutionized smart infrastructure and healthcare worldwide. Elijah was used to luxury and discretion, but what he wasn't used to was disrespect. And certainly not the kind that would come from someone in uniform who should have known better. As Elijah stepped onto Flight 709 to London, first-class passengers settled in with champagne flutes and hushed calls. But from the moment Elijah entered the cabin, something shifted. He could feel eyes on him, not admiring, but scrutinizing, measuring him by his skin before his seat number. Dressed in a Balmain hoodie and speaking politely, Elijah handed over his boarding pass to the head flight attendant, a middle-aged woman named Carol, whose eyes flicked to the paper, then to his face, narrowing with suspicion. "This isn't Coach," she said, not a question but an accusation, her voice laced with disbelief. Elijah smiled politely. "No, ma'am, my father booked it." Carol didn't move. "Who's your father again?" she asked as if he were lying. Elijah responded calmly, "Malcolm Bryant." That name should have been a keycard to respect. Instead, Carol scoffed and leaned close. "Sure he is. Sit down and don't cause any trouble." Elijah blinked, confused but not confrontational. He took his seat and put on his headphones. Moments later, Carol returned, her face tight with something ugly. "Excuse me," she barked. "I need to check your ticket again." She snatched it from his tray without permission, startling the older man seated next to him. The man looked up and said gently, "Ma'am, he's been very polite. Is there a problem?" But Carol ignored him. "I knew it," she snapped suddenly. "This is fraudulent." She turned to Elijah. "You need to come with me, now." Elijah stood slowly, confused, embarrassed, every pair of eyes in first class locked on him. "I think there's been a mistake," he said. But as he turned toward the aisle, Carol slapped him. The sharp crack echoed down the cabin, and the entire section froze. Elijah staggered back, stunned not just by the pain, but by the disbelief. No one moved for a full 10 seconds. Then a woman screamed. A man stood. A video began recording, but the damage was done. Carol stood there, breathing hard, suddenly realizing what she'd just done. Elijah slowly turned, blood in his mouth, and pulled out his phone. He said just 4 words into the receiver. "Dad, she hit me." 2 minutes later, the plane doors were sealed. Not for takeoff, but for lockdown. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unexpected delay. Please remain seated." But behind the scenes, it wasn't technical. It wasn't weather. It was the flight didn't budge. Not an inch. 38 minutes had passed since the slap, and not a single wheel rolled down the runway. Flight 709 had become a hostage of its own consequences. Elijah sat back in seat 1A, holding an ice pack from a sympathetic flight nurse who had been summoned late. The entire first-class cabin was murmuring with low confusion, passengers whispering, watching, speculating. But Elijah wasn't crying, wasn't yelling. He was calm, too calm. Because the moment he'd made that phone call to his father, he had passed the matter into hands far more powerful than Carol could comprehend. Meanwhile, back at Bryant Tower in Manhattan, Malcolm Bryant stood on the 89th floor in his private office, a room of glass and steel and silence, staring at his phone as the call from Elijah ended. There were moments when a father knows the world must be reminded of who his family is. This was one of them. Malcolm didn't scream or break things. He pressed one button on his desk that patched through to his legal chief, press team, aviation investor board, and his personal pilot. "Freeze the flight," he said. "Now." And in the world of billion-dollar influence, it happened in less than 5 minutes. Carol, still shaken but defensive, paced near the cockpit, attempting to talk her way out of what she had done. "I didn't know who he was," she hissed to the co-pilot. He was mouthing off. He looked suspicious. What was I supposed to think? The co-pilot just stared at her with tight lips, unsure whether to respond or just stay out of it. In the cabin, the older man next to Elijah, Mr. Randolph, a retired diplomat, finally spoke. "Son, I saw what happened. She didn't just overreact, she profiled you." Elijah nodded silently. "It's always like this. Unless we make it not like this." Behind them, a younger couple had already uploaded the video. Within 20 minutes, it hit the front page of Twitter. By minute 30, news anchors were requesting statements. "Flight attendant assaults teen in first class," the headline screamed. "Unprovoked, racially charged, VIP victim." Carol's face was all over the web. Her Facebook, her LinkedIn, and her Reddit posts about today's youth resurfaced, with brutal irony. But inside the plane, the flight crew had just received a direct message from the airline's CEO. "Do not take off. Await further instructions." That never happened. Flights don't freeze for discipline, but this one had. And as passengers began realizing that someone on board had power that extended beyond the cockpit, tension boiled. Elijah's father wasn't waiting for the airline to respond. He was controlling the response. 45 minutes after the slap, 2 black SUVs rolled up directly to the tarmac, a highly unusual breach of protocol. From the vehicle stepped Malcolm Bryant himself, flanked by legal aides, publicists, and security. He was dressed in tailored navy, his presence silent thunder. Airline executives were already scrambling at the gate, pale and apologetic. "Mr. Bryant, we didn't know." He cut them off. "You did know. You just didn't care until now." When the door of the plane opened, every passenger turned. Cameras lifted. Malcolm stepped on board, nodded at his son, then turned to Carol, who stood frozen near the galley. "You assaulted my child," he said, voice even. "And you did. It because he didn't look like he belonged in first class." Carol stuttered, suddenly pale. I didn't know." "Didn't know he was my son?" Malcolm asked. "Or didn't know he was human?" The silence was deep. Even the engines outside seemed to stop humming. A few passengers clapped quietly. Elijah stood up. "Let's go, Dad." Malcolm looked at the stunned flight crew. "This flight's not going anywhere until this woman is removed. And my legal team is filing federal charges." Carol gasped. But no one came to her defense, not even the captain. Within 5 minutes, she was escorted off the aircraft in complete silence. But that wasn't the end. It was just the spark. Because what happened next exploded far beyond the cabin. The moment Malcolm and Elijah exited the aircraft, the airline attempted damage control. Press releases, statements, a weak apology blaming training errors. But it was too late. Social media had erupted. Hashtags like #Justice for Elijah and #First Class while black trended worldwide. Influencers, politicians, celebrities all jumped into the storm. And in the center was a 17-year-old boy who hadn't said a word online yet. But his silence only made the world listen harder. Within 24 hours, Malcolm's legal team filed a civil suit for racial discrimination, physical assault, emotional trauma, and defamation. The airline, facing tanking stocks, begged for a settlement, but Malcolm refused. "We don't settle silence," he said. Carol, meanwhile, was fired, disgraced, and hounded by media. But it wasn't just about her. It was about the culture that had enabled her to look at a young black man and assume he didn't belong. Bryant Tech used its influence to launch a nationwide campaign called Check Your Bias, partnering with airlines to retrain and re-educate flight crews, while also publishing anonymous employee testimonials about discrimination in luxury spaces. Elijah, reluctant but wise, finally gave a live interview. In it, he said calmly, "I wasn't angry because she slapped me. I was angry because she saw me as a threat before I even said a word." The nation listened. Schools discussed it. The case never reached court. It didn't have to, because the airline agreed to pay $80 million in restitution and launch a massive racial equity overhaul. But Elijah didn't keep the money. He redirected it into a fund for minority youth in aviation and hospitality careers. "Let's get more people in those uniforms," he said, "who look like me and who won't forget who they once were." The moment went viral all over again. Even major networks called it one of the most dignified responses to injustice ever seen. But not everyone was thrilled. There were people in the shadows, shareholders, business rivals who didn't like that a black boy had brought a trillion-dollar transport empire to its knees. They weren't done. They were just 6 months later. Elijah sat aboard a different jet, his father's private one. But this time, he was heading to speak at the UN Youth Empowerment Summit in Geneva. He looked older, stronger, and clearer than ever before. But he had a secret he hadn't told the world yet. Something strange had happened on Flight 709 something the public hadn't heard. Just after the slap and before the plane was ordered still, Elijah had taken off his headphones and caught a glimpse of the cockpit door slightly ajar. He'd heard something. A voice on the radio, not from a TC, a code word he remembered from one of his father's emergency drills, code sandglass. That term had nothing to do with airlines. It was the call sign for a silent alert used in corporate espionage scenarios. Elijah had never told anyone, not even his dad. But over the months, he'd dug, researched, hacked, and what he found was chilling. Carol hadn't acted alone. Someone had planted her. The slap wasn't random. It was staged to provoke a reaction and destroy Malcolm Bryant's public image as a calm and measured leader. The plan had been to push Elijah to react violently. Had he done so, the headlines would have painted him as aggressive, spoiled, dangerous. But he hadn't, and the plan had failed. Yet the group behind it remained hidden until Elijah tracked them to a private think tank backed by Bryant Tech's largest rival. The attempt hadn't just been racial, it had been political, financial. $1 billion takedown disguised as a slap. Now holding all the files on a drive around his neck, Elijah knew what he had to do next. As the jet touched down in Geneva, he whispered to himself, "They came for me on a plane. Now I'm coming for them at the highest level." And he stepped off into a world that was listening.